Hey guys, my name is Jason with S&J Forest Products, and on today's video I wanted to talk a little bit about the replanting I've done here. I've worked for 2 springs now, 2 seasons, on getting my 50-acre woodlot in Skagit County, Washington replanted, and I wanted to go over some of my experiences and a lot of my mistakes I made early on. So hopefully you guys, if you're going to do any replanting, can kind of learn from my mistakes and kind of do it right the first time. So let's take a look at some of the stuff I did last year now. This was the first year I planted these white stakes here. And I'll show you what I did, what worked and what didn't, and then we'll go and take a look at what I've done this spring at another site and show you how I've improved my system. So you can see all these white stakes with blue cones behind me here. And this is the stuff, like I mentioned earlier, I planted about a year ago. And we planted about 400 trees in mixed open, and then there's some back here in the canopy as well. And this was the first planting I've ever done. This was the kind of my first go at it. And all the reading I've done online talks about how you want to stake the tree and cone it for deer browse, keep the deer out of it. It makes a little greenhouse effect in there. It keeps the seedling protected, warmed up, it grows better, blah, 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 blah. That did not work for me. And so let's go take a look at what happened to some of my seedlings, and I'll show you why these cones didn't work for me. So here's one of my seedlings, and probably the first thing you're going is, holy cow, what's going on with all this grass? This is a really, really invasive reed canary grass here. It grows really aggressively, mats out everything down on the floor. It dies, and you'll get these huge mats that prevent anything from coming up through it. So it's really, really invasive. The one weakness it has is it's shade intolerant. And so if I can get some of my seedlings here to grow up and shade this grass out, it should kill it. Now this is a terrible, terrible looking seedling. We're just starting to get bud burst coming on here. It's about 1st of May. But I wanted to talk about these blue cones that I put up in stakes here for a minute. What you're supposed to do is cover the leader and, the top half of the tree, these seedlings, with these blue cones. And there's several reasons to do that. Deer browse was one of my major concerns. And so I covered up the top, 6, 8, 10 inches, maybe more, with these blue cones in the spring, right after I planted them in March of 2021. And I came out and they were all doing great and everything was doing perfect and they were growing and they had burst their buds and they were doing really good. And then in June of 2021, the Pacific Northwest had this huge, massive heat wave. And it got over 100 degrees here, which is absolutely record-breaking for us. And what happened is this blue cone was covering the leader of this tree, and it just cooked it. It just got really, really hot in there. You can imagine that that's like being inside of a glass box, more or less. And so even though it was 100 or 105 degrees outside, it was probably 140 degrees inside that cone. And so I lost a lot of my leaders on a lot of my trees, and this is a prime example of that. The tree is still alive. You can see the buds are coming. It's still green. It's not very healthy. But this is one of the things that happened to me this last spring. So I have kind of sworn off these cones. What I have found is that the deer don't tend to browse my Douglas fir. They tend to browse my western red cedar. And the cones do a good job of protecting from tree browse. This one has not been browsed. It's got a little bit of a double top going, so I'll have to figure that one out. But I need to figure out a way to protect my western red cedar from deer browse. So let's go see if we can find some western red cedar with some bad deer browse, and I'll talk about that issue. Here's a sorry, sad little cedar that has been terribly browsed. They ate the leader. This tree was probably, I don't know, that tall. And in the winter, I found, starting about October, the deer come in and they find all these little cedar seedlings and they browse just every little branch all the way, pretty much all the way down to the bottom. And so that's a real problem because all the new growth gets eaten. So this fall, I'm going to try something different. It's called tiller netting. And it's basically just a cone of netting that you put down over the leader of the cedars. And that's supposed to prevent the deer from browsing and getting this problem that we have. And once I can get these seedlings up 6, 8, 10 feet high, the deer can't reach them. And then I don't have to worry about it because then the leader's protected by their height and they can just grow up through and there's not a problem. But I'm going to try tiller netting this fall. What I found is the deer actually don't bother them during the growing season. So starting about April, May, all the way through the summer, they don't actually get any browse. So it's going to be a fall time project where I come in, find my cedars, cover the leader in tiller netting, and then I'm going to have to come back in the spring and take them off so the branches and the leader don't all grow through the tiller netting and get all caught up in there, and I got to cut them out. So it's going to be a little bit of a process, but hopefully these things can start growing 2-3 feet a year, and in 3 to 5 years I won't have to worry about browse or tiller netting anymore. Initially, I planted 4 different types of trees. I had Douglas fir, grand fir, western red cedar, and hemlock. And those are all native here. They should all grow really well. One of the issues I've had is it's really, really important to pick your site and what trees should grow on your site. Because just because they're all native here doesn't mean that they actually should all grow on the ground that I have. I have a flat lowland site. It has clay really, really shallow under the soils. And it's really wet. The water tends to pool on top of the soil. And I have these little forest wetlands and pools. Even though Douglas fir is kind of the classic tree to plant here for timber habitat, it grows really well, it's really drought resistant. My site is just a little bit too wet. So it's really important to pick the site that you have and pick the trees for that site so you don't end up planting a bunch of trees that end up dying. Here's a good shot of the reed canary grass just smothering everything. Nothing is growing here except for the canary grass. And I planted a bunch of trees in here last year, mostly Douglas fir, hemlock, and cedar. And the Doug fir are doing okay. Almost every hemlock has died. And the cedar are actually performing really well. I don't know if they can deal with the crowding issue or if they're shade tolerant enough that they can deal with the shade of the grass. But here's a Doug and it's pretty much dead. The leader got cooked like I mentioned earlier. There's a little green sprig down here. I doubt this tree will make it. But the cedars actually seem to do pretty good here. Another tree that might do well is a spruce. And here's a good example of a spruce tree growing right out of the middle of this canary grass. The spruce and the cedar also like it wet, and the canary grass is kind of notorious for growing in kind of wet areas, swampy areas, and the Dougs don't do well there. But I want to show you the example here. If you pull back this spruce branch, see under that tree there's no grass. There's hardly any canary grass. It shaded it all out, and I'm probably standing 10 feet away from the base of that tree. So you can imagine if there was trees planted every 15 or 20 feet, their branches would just be touching now. They would have shaded out all this grass. And so I'm hoping in the next 10 or 15 years that this all gets grown up and shaded out with the branches of the trees. Now, the other thing that's very common with an industrial forest or industrial practices is they would probably never plant in this to begin with. They would scrape it all off with a dozer or something, or they'd spray it and kill it with some herbicide. But after they plant, they will come in and the next year or 2 or 3 will go around at the base of each one of these trees, and they'll go around and they'll spray it. And they'll spray herbicide, and they'll make a 5-foot, 3, 5, 7-foot cone around the bottom of those trees, and it kills everything. Doesn't affect the tree, and so it gives the tree a real head start. It takes care of all the competition, all the other bushes and shrubs and grasses, and it kills all that, so the tree actually gets all the water, all the nutrients from the soil around it, and it can just shoot up real quick. A lot of people use that stuff, the herbicides. I'm going to try real hard not to. I'm going to try and it will take longer for my trees to get growing up above the grass, and they're going to be fighting with the grass until they can shade it out around themselves. They're going to be fighting for water. They're going to be fighting for nutrients. but I'm going to try and get this grass killed off naturally with just planting trees in it. I'm going to give it 2, 3, 4 years. If that doesn't work, if I can't actually kill the grass or have the trees grow up through it, then I'll come in and scrape it all off or do something, maybe spray it and start from scratch, because I really want this to grow up and get seeded, get it turned into a forest. But if I can't do it just planting them in the grass, I'm going to have to find another way to do it. Another problem we have is all these Himalayan blackberries, and they're everywhere. They're actually kind of also invasive, but they're actually competing with the canary grass, and I don't know who's winning, but it's a battle. And you know, it sucks. It sucks to walk through. They grow a huge amount. They'll grow 20 feet liters in a year. They're all full of spikes and spines. It really sucks to walk through them. And so the first 5 to 10 years of your tree lot getting planted and growing up, your wood lot really is the most important phase for you to come in, take care of your trees, make sure they're doing well. Because if you just leave them in that first 5 years, especially with all these invasives, you're not going to have much of a forest. Here's another heavily browsed cedar. They came in, nipped all the tops, but you can see right there at my thumb. Let's see if we can get that in focus. There's little buds coming. There's new growth coming down here. Focus the camera here. There's some new growth coming here. So we're going to let this tree grow as fast and as crazy as it can all year. And then I'll come in with tiller netting and I'll cover the leader this fall and see if we can get this tree to grow up and protect it in the winter and get 3 or 4 feet and get up above the deer. Here's kind of a success story for our cedars. And I know it's hard to tell with the green background of the grass, but this stuff wasn't browsed too bad. It may have got the little tips right here, but that's a pretty healthy looking cedar still. I planted this one a year ago. All this green growth here was all the growth from last year. So it grew, I don't know, maybe 9 inches in its first year and maybe more. It got nipped there, it looks like a little bit. But 9 inches the first year isn't too bad. Hopefully I can get twice that this year. So it'll be up, somewhere in this area. And another 2 years of that, and it'll be above the deer and above the grass. And it should be growing pretty good. These cedars seem to do the best in the canary grass. I think it's a combination of wet ground, which they like. They're shade tolerant, and they're probably also tolerant of quite a bit of competition because they're shade tolerant and can grow in the understory. So I've had the best luck and the best success with this canary grass and cedar trees. Here is one of our losers. This was a little hemlock that I planted last year. It's pretty much dead. And it's odd because I've had really bad luck with the hemlock. I haven't had hardly any survival rate on the hemlock, but I have hemlock all over my site. They naturally seed. There's little hemlock seedlings all over the place. I'll show you some here later in the video. They grow really well here. I have some huge old hemlocks as well, but it doesn't seem like hemlock plants very well around here, and I'm not quite sure why. One other thing I'll mention about kind of the survival rate of my trees is a typical survival rate, it sounds like from the research I've done online, is about 80 to 90%. If it's a good site and you have good weather during the first summer, you can have some pretty good survival rates. I've kind of tallied up what I lost from last year, and with that heat dome, everybody had problems. It wasn't just me, it was everybody throughout the Pacific Northwest. I ended up with about 60% survival rate for the first year. But a lot of my trees, even though they survived, they're still not in great condition. So it's going to take 2 or 3 years to get going and get them up kind of to where they were before the leaders all died. But I heard there's a lot of growers down in Oregon, Southern Oregon, where it got hotter on the west side of the Cascades. They lost 100%. It just wiped out the entire crop. Christmas tree growers, people, the industrial forests that were getting replanted, just everything just got wiped out, just 100% kill. So there's some real issues or concerns with everything getting warmed up and drought conditions and getting too hot for some of the native trees around here in the west side of the Cascades. Here's a Doug fir from last year, and this one actually kept its leader. It's still, you can see the needles on there are a little bit brown. It's not doing fantastic. The needles down here are looking better, but the needles in that cone, I just took the cone off it, are brown. They really don't like those cones. Here's that blue cone I'm talking about. They're about 4 inches in diameter, 3-4 inches diameter. I used PVC so it didn't rot and I could reuse them, and I just zip tied it to the pole. But this one survived the heat dome, the high temperatures. It's just starting to get some new green growth coming there. So it's doing pretty good. Hopefully this year, again, this is what grew last year, about 6-8 inches, which isn't great, but it survived. So that's the important part. But hopefully we can get a foot or more of growth out of this leader this year. I don't see, see every tip of the branch has green coming. And so that's an example of a Doug fir that's doing pretty good. It's starting to get choked out though. We've got a lot of stuff coming up around it, a lot of competition. So that tree needs to get it in high gear, and I'll come around and stomp around it and kind of get the brush out of the way, keep it as clear around there as I can, and give it every chance without herbicides to get up above the brush. Once they get up 6-8 feet, you're pretty much good. But that's where it's planted. But imagine trying to grow up through stuff like that. That stuff's about 6 feet high. Blackberries, salmonberries, canary grass. It's going to be real tough for something that's 2 feet high to get started and grow through that. So you got to really keep these trees clear around there, keep them as little competition as possible, and give them every chance to get up their first 3 to 5 years up above all this junk so they can really start getting in the sun and flourishing. So here's an example of where the cone actually worked. This is a cedar. I kept the cone on it through the winter. And you can see here where the deer came by, they browsed all the branches off that they could get to. But if you look down the cone, it's all nice and green down there. The leader's untouched. Let me pull it off of there so you can get a little better view. See, there's the nice green leader of the cedar. It's coming up. It's doing really well. And so the cone in theory works for protection, but I just think sometimes it gets too hot in there, and they're really, really expensive. I mean, the cones are expensive, the PVC is expensive. It's a lot of work getting all the PVC stakes out into the woods. So I'm going to try this tiller netting, see how that works. But the idea is, regardless of what you use, if you can protect the leader and get the tree up above the browse, you're doing good. Now, the other problem that a lot of my neighbors have, or around here in the Pacific Northwest, is the elk come in and they'll browse the Doug fir. So far, I haven't seen any of that on my trees. Let's look over here. Here's another cedar. But the Doug fir sometimes get browsed, but I haven't had any experience with that on my site. Not a bad looking cedar. There's the green starting about where my thumb is all new growth from last year. The leader was protected, so it hasn't been browsed. Even the lower branches on this one still look pretty good. They're not browsed at all. There's less competition than some of those earlier Dougs we looked at. So this tree in the next 3 to 5 years will be up above the brush if I can protect that leader, and we'll get a forest growing in here. This is a grand fir. And again, the leader, I lost the leader last year, but you can see all the new growth coming down around there. We'll train one of these new shoots up as the replacement leader. And there's even, looks like we might get some buds here as well. So we'll get a new leader coming up on this tree. It's just because it lost its leader doesn't mean it's dead or done for. It did have some damage last year from the heat. But I think it's going to survive. I think it's going to make it. And we'll train it up. It's going to lose a year or 2 or 3 of potential, I guess you could say. If we hadn't lost a leader, it would have just shot up above, but now it's got to take a year or two to get another leader kind of up this high, and then it's going to take a little while to recover from the heat. But that's a grand fir. These are real shade tolerant, and they grow pretty good in the wet. So I planted some of these. Their timber value isn't really very high, but they grow here, and one of my primary goals is to get a forest going. So, and they grow big. They're big trees, good for wildlife habitat. So we'll see if we can get some grand fir growing here on our site. So here's another grand fir, and this one's doing actually pretty good. Here's the growth last year from here to here. It's about a foot or more. The leader looks really good. There's 5 or 6 radial buds that are going to be the limb whorl, the limbs on the next year's growth. And then you have the bud in the very middle there that's going to come up through and be the leader. So this is actually a pretty good success here for getting a grand growing up. And the amount of growth it had in its first year is great. And usually kind of the rule of thumb, so they say, is if you can get a foot growth out of the first year, 2 feet out of the second year, and 3 feet out of the third year, that's doing really pretty good. So we've got our first foot of growth. So hopefully this year, this little bud here is going to grow up about 2 feet, and it'll end up being a 3 or 4 foot tree. So this is kind of a sad story here. This little curly Q thing is another cedar. And this is one I did not plant. This is a volunteer. Heavily browsed all the way down. All the branches have been browsed by deer. You can see the size of the trunk down here is about the width of my finger. It's about maybe through half an inch, 5/8 of an inch thick. This tree is maybe 2.5 feet tall, and it may be 10 years old. It may be older than that because it just can't grow up past the deer because they keep browsing on it. I protected it with a cone this fall and kept the leader. So there's the new leader. It looks in really actually good condition, good shape. So it's gonna, if I can keep it protected, it's gonna grow up and get above the browse problem, and then it'll be doing really pretty good. But there's a few of these around. I found these volunteers that come up and they just can't quite get up above the browse problem. So I'm gonna try and help them and get up and grow into a nice tree. So up until now, all the trees we've looked at have been stuff I planted last year. So it's been a full growing season and through the winter. It's springtime now, so they're just starting to come out. But I wanted to talk a little bit while we walked to this other site where we planted trees this spring, is the goals that you may have for your woodlot or your site, because depending on what your goal is, you might have a different approach to coming up and plant trees. And so I'll talk about some of my goals here. My goals for sure, number one is just to have a forest again, to regrow this into a nice full forest. Have wildlife habitat is the second one. So have you know, even though I'm having deer problems, get a habitat where the deer come in. I've actually put up some wildlife cameras. I've seen deer and elk, coyote, bear. There was my neighbor spotted a cougar here last summer, and all the other little stuff that goes in the forest floor that you don't see, the frogs and the salamanders and all the bugs and all the stuff. So wildlife habitat is high on my list. Another one is you know, industrial forest. Get some production, some wood production off the forest sometime in the future. It doesn't have to be, I mean, it could be, but it probably won't be in my lifetime. But my kids might end up logging some of this in the future for revenue, thin it out for habitat, and get a little revenue going. So that's one. And then the other one for me is actually carbon sequestration. And I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I do know that just starting over the last 5 years or so, a lot of forest landowners in Washington are starting to look at this carbon sequestration credit or carbon revenue, where companies will pay you so much an acre for your trees and letting your trees grow, sequester carbon, offset their carbon emissions. So regardless of what happens or what your views are, there's some real potential for small forest landowners to have some impressive revenue from just letting your trees grow. And so all of those things are my goals. And so you got to ask yourself when you're starting to replant or thinking about replanting, what are my goals? You know, is it just for revenue and wood production? Are you going to plant monoculture Doug fir? Is habitat even considered? Do you want to diversify at all? Plant some hardwoods maybe for some alternate types of revenue? Do you want to do a habitat only? Do you want to do carbon sequestration only? So I think it's really important as you go through this whole process to take a season even to think about what your goals are, because my goals have certainly changed. I've owned this property about a year, and my goals have changed pretty significantly over that first year as I did some logging, cleaned up some of the dead and dying stuff, salvaged a bunch of cedar, and I think my goals will evolve as things go on. But as you start to plant, you know, you're deciding what the forest is going to look like for the next 20, 30, 50, 100, 200 years, depending on what your goals and your plans are for the property. So it's something to really consider before you just go out, buy a bunch of trees and shove them in the ground, because it might change over a year or two, and the last thing you want to do is come in and start tearing out all the trees you put in because you planted the wrong kind, or they're not the type you wanted, or whatever. So something to consider. But let's go take a look at some of the trees I planted this spring, what I learned from my past mistakes about the cones and the grass, and we'll see how the new trees are doing. They've been in the ground for about a month and a half now. We'll see how they're doing. Now we're out here in another site that we prepped and planted this early spring. And this again was pretty much a complete canary grass field. There was nothing growing in here other than canary grass. It was a thick mat of canary grass. I did another video, you can check it out on my channel, of how I prepped this site. And I'll go over it here real quick. I got it here with my skidder before it started to green up. And I went along and I dropped the blade and scraped for about 6-8 feet. And I lift the blade and it all flopped in a pile in front. And then I dropped the blade and grade some more. And so I have these patches here, where I've scraped off the grass. And so I really want to see how this goes over the next couple of years by essentially eliminating all the competition around the seedlings for the first year anyway. There's going to be a bunch of stuff come up in these little holes that I made. This is going to compete with that tree. But if I can give the tree a head start and get up a couple feet above everything else before the second year, that's going to really help out the chances of survival. So we'll go take a closer look here. We planted all sorts of different kind of trees. I've added a couple different type of trees. So we'll go take a look at what we got going. I'll just kind of slowly walk through. We planted about 500 trees in this field, and I bought some flags so I could find them. That's really pretty expensive. These are about 16 cents a flag, and so that can really add up over a couple thousand trees. But here's a grand fir. Again, they like the wet, kind of clay, silt, kind of gougey wet. But you can see all the buds are starting to burst on it. It's greening up. It's doing really well. This one was planted kind of right at the edge of this patch I made with the skidder. You can see the wet puddles and stuff where I drove my skidder through. Here's a cedar. Somebody didn't do a great job planting this one. You can see the roots. You want to make sure the collar is covered so the roots don't get a bunch of air in them and dry out. But this is a cedar. It's doing okay. It doesn't look fantastic, but a lot of times they bronze up right after you get planted. And then when they start growing, they'll start getting green shoots on their tips. There's a cedar. Here's another cedar over here. Let's see, this one's maybe starting to green up a little bit on the tips there of the branches. This one is something I picked up. I picked up about 300 of these. This is a sequoia, giant sequoia. This one doesn't look very good, but it's still green enough. It's still alive. And the sequoia are interesting because, one, they can grow to a really, really big tree. They grow really, really fast. They grow pretty well in Western Washington. But they're from a little bit farther south, so they're used to maybe a little bit drier conditions, a little bit warmer temperatures. So even if we start getting some really high heat for this area, you might have some of these trees that I've planted from imported, essentially from down south, that are going to do better at survival. Here's a Doug fir. This one looks to be doing very well. Bud burst is coming. See all the new shoots going there. Nice leader forming. Again, this was planted a month and a half ago or so. And so that's really encouraging. It's planted right in the middle of this big area where there's nothing else grown. It doesn't have any competition right now. That's going to go good. There's another Doug. You can see the bright green shoots coming. Those both look like they're doing pretty good. Here's one that appears to be struggling a little bit. All the needles have turned brown and are falling off, but look at all the new shoots coming. It seems to be either putting all its energy into getting the new shoots going. It was a little bit of a shock. May have been just a bad seedling. Could have had some issues with the site, but hopefully if it can get a bunch of new shoots coming and survive the first summer. Again, it's planted in this nice open area, no competition. But it's really nice to have, here's one that's struggling. The buds aren't even close to bursting on this one yet. The needles are turning brown. This one, and actually that other one, I'll show you. I don't know if I can get this, but Douglas fir are not shade tolerant at all. And this one's planted kind of under the edge of this alder here. So I don't know if this one and then that one over there may be having some shade issues, but hopefully they can overcome it. There's a cedar starting to see. You can start to see the green come out on the shoots here. I don't know if you can see that, but look how brown it is, man. It looks like it's all bronzy brown. It looks dead, but it's not. It's still very much alive. Let's see what else we can find here. Here's a Doug fir that's going gangbusters. Look at all the new growth on him. Planted over kind of in the edge against the canary grass. See if we can get him to get up above the shade there. Here's a little tiny Doug seedling. It seems to be doing okay. Needles are all green. Its buds are starting to burst. So yeah, here you can notice I didn't put any cones. I haven't covered them. I flagged them so I can find them. But it seems just on the initial walkthrough that these are doing so much better without the competition than those other ones were that we looked at from last year. Because you can see where this leader might grow a foot or more this season. And the leaders we saw in a bunch of the ones previous only had about 6 inches on them. Here's another sequoia that's doing better than the first one we looked at. This one's still pretty green. The buds are just starting to come up there and grow. So hopefully we can get some sequoia going. But let's go take a look. You can see I did the patches here. Let's go take a look over here. There's a section where I left the canary grass in place. And we'll go take a look at some of the trees I planted direct in the canary grass, see how they're doing. So here's where I put some trees directly in the canary grass. And they seem to be doing okay for now. But their buds are out, they're greening up. There's one, here's one over here. Same thing, another Doug fir, greening up. This one's doing pretty good. Seems to have lost some of its needles, browned up a little bit, but all the new growth is coming. So hopefully that tree makes it. Here's a grand fir. Seems like the grand firs are a little bit behind the Dougs. This one doesn't have any new growth on it yet coming out. Here's a Doug fir that's struggling a little bit. You can see the orange there. Here's a big old Doug. It's probably 2 feet tall. It hasn't bud burst yet, but man, they're getting close. Here's a little cedar. That's going to be struggling to survive right there. See if that can get above the grass. Here's another Doug struggling. And I think it's a combination with these Dougs. We're down in a really wet spot right now. So they're fighting between the grass and the wet. Here's another grand. It's doing okay. Green. No new growth yet. Here's a big Doug that's just starting to grow. And these big ones, this one again is maybe 18 inches or 2 feet tall. And it seems like the canary grass in here gets maybe 3-4 feet tall. Some sites it can get 6 or 8 feet tall, but in here it doesn't get too tall. And so hopefully this tree is already tall enough to where it won't be shaded out too bad by the canary grass. Same with this one over here. This one's pretty tall. You can see that tree there. This Doug is struggling. It's got some new growth coming, but it's pretty small down there in a hole. Here's a cedar down in a hole. It's still green, but it's going to need some attention if it's going to grow and get up there. So there's some examples of what's going on in the canary grass. It looks like more trees are struggling and they seem to be farther behind. Here's another one. The buds aren't out yet. So the competition is really taking a toll in the grass versus over here where we've planted them out in some patches that are bare. So here's another site on my property. And over the last 2 years, me and my wife and kids and families and friends have planted about 2,000 trees on this site. And it's pretty much the end of the planting season now. And I reached out to my nursery where I get all my seedlings from. And they were having a big sale trying to get rid of the seedlings they had. And so I bought another 5,000 trees about a week ago. And got them in the ground, and one of the conditions was I couldn't plant them. There was too many. So I hired a crew of guys. 6 guys came out, professional tree planters. They started about 6:30, and they were done planting 5,000 trees by noon. It was the craziest thing I've ever seen. It was almost like they were walking through the forest. They hardly ever stopped to put a tree in the ground because they were doing it so fast. They could get a hole opened up, put a tree in, step on it, almost in the same time it took them to take a step through the woods. So it was pretty cool to watch. But we planted 5,000 more trees, and I was in a big struggle, a big rush to get the site prepped for them. And that's what I'm walking through now. This is an alder site where the alders have grown up thick. And I came in, I don't know if you can see them behind me, but I came in and thinned the alder out pretty heavily. I left about a stem every 15 or 20 feet. But let me flip the camera around so we can see the seedlings they put in, and I'll talk a little bit about the strategy with the alders. So we added a few species of trees. Here's one, that's a spruce. These were planted about 4 days ago, so they haven't been doing anything yet as far as growth. There's another spruce. There's a third spruce over there. Spruce grow really well on this site. I have some of my biggest trees by far are spruce. But you can see all the slash. I just cut the alders out and I left a few standing. And the idea is, going back to our goals, you've got some diversity in the trees. These are hardwoods here in Western Washington, so you have some good diversity. You leave some trees growing. They still have their carbon sequestered in their trunks. The wildlife really like them. Over time, I don't know if you can see, this one's dying or dead actually. They will die off because they're not a very long-lived tree. They live about 100 years as an ancient alder. So somewhere in the 50 to 100 year range. These are about 20 years. So these could be about halfway through their life. But alders are really, really good at fixing nitrogen. So they essentially are fertilizing the soil as they grow. I've opened up the canopy enough to where enough light gets down through to the seedlings that they can get established and grow, probably slower, under the canopy alder. But as these alder grow up and die off, you'll have more and more sun come down through the canopy and encourage these trees to grow. So this is like a successional forest situation. Alders are a pioneering species. So when the land was disturbed here about 20 years ago, they came in and just grew like dog hair, just so thick. They grew up, covered the whole area in alders, and they're fixing nitrogen in the soil. And now I've come in and planted some of these seedlings, evergreens, that will live for hundreds of years. And they can grow up and succeed the alder as the alder die off. And we don't have to wait for the alder to all die to come in and plant, because these trees, these seedlings, can survive in this moderate shade, light shade that these alders are going to produce. So it's kind of a jump start. We're jump starting the rotation here on this forest, and we're going to have trees a lot sooner. We're going to have forest a lot sooner than we would have otherwise if we just let nature take its course. So I hope you guys learned a little bit about what I'm doing, some of my mistakes, and some of my history here planting. I'll update you guys every so often as things happen and mature here on my woodlot. But I appreciate you guys watching. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave me a comment in the comment section below. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.